A widow stood in the doorway of a dying cabin, and the mountain wind did not care. It moved through the gaps in the log walls the way grief moves through a house after someone is gone, finding every crack, every weakness, every place where warmth used to live. The woman's name was Mara Weston. She was 38 years old. She had rough hands, steady eyes, and a daughter sleeping inside who coughed like something small and fragile caught in a machine. She did not go back inside yet. She stood there and looked at the valley below, where the town of lanterns and smoke sat fat and certain of itself. And she breathed in air that already carried winter's first warning. Brittle, crystalline, sharpened at the edges like a blade that had not yet been drawn. She was not afraid of the cold. She had grown up cold. What frightened her was the mathematics of it. 3 months of winter. A woodpile that would last 6 weeks. A daughter whose lungs had already lost one argument with the frost. And a piece of paper sitting on the table inside, written in a hand she did not trust, suggesting that the sensible thing, the merciful thing, would be to sell. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of that, before the paper and the cold and the long nights that were coming, there is something you need to know. Something that happened at the very end of this story, which is the only way to understand how it began. On the morning after the worst night the valley had ever conjured, the people of the town came out of the bark cabin one by one. They emerged into a world made unrecognizable by snow, blinking in the thin, pale light, and they stood for a moment looking at the structure that had held them through the dark. Some of them reached out and touched the walls as they passed, not to test them, just to feel them, the way you touch something you did not expect to survive. Silas Drummond was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the most powerful man in town, the man who had built every house for 30 miles in any direction, the man who had called this place a madness, and its builder a liability, and he looked at the bark-covered walls with an expression no one in town had ever seen on his face before. He wept, not loudly, just a few tears that froze before they reached his jaw. No one in town ever knew why, until now. Because tucked inside a battered tin box on the highest shelf of that cabin was a letter. Old paper, careful handwriting. The letter had traveled a great distance and arrived too late, left behind by the man who had lived in this cabin before Mara, a man named Erickson who had died alone the previous winter with his knowledge intact and unshared. When Drummond stepped through the door the night before and saw the box on the shelf, his face had changed. Something drained out of it. He recognized the handwriting before Mara had any reason to touch it. That letter would not be opened for many hours yet, but it was there. And everything, every decision, every cruelty, every act of courage that filled the months between that autumn evening and that brutal winter night, everything flows from what was written inside it. The cabin had been Alexi's dream. Alexi Weston had been a miner and a builder and a man of careful, unhurried hope. He had chosen this plot on the slope above town because it caught the morning light and because the stand of birch trees at the edge of the property reminded him, he said, of something from before. He had laid the foundation himself. He had notched the first logs himself. He had carved his name into the doorframe with a small knife slowly on a Sunday afternoon, while Zosha sat nearby and watched. He had not lived to finish the walls. The mine took him in the way mines take men, without warning, without apology, without anything left behind to argue with. One morning, He went down into the dark, and the dark decided to keep him. 4 other men went with him into that silence. The town grieved for a week and then moved on the way towns do. Mara did not move on. She moved into the unfinished cabin with its crumbling chinking and its half-notched logs and its single glass window that rattled in any wind above a whisper. She moved in because there was nowhere else, and because Alexi's name was on the doorframe, and because Zosha needed walls around her more than she needed warmth. The walls, as it turned out, would have to provide both. Silas Drummond came to visit in early autumn. He was polite the way powerful men are polite when they have already decided the outcome of a conversation. He walked the perimeter of the cabin with his hands clasped behind his back. He poked at the chinking with one thick finger. He looked at the woodpile, and then looked at the sky, and then looked back at Mara with an expression that was almost kind. The sensible thing, he said, would be to sell. He knew a man who would give her a fair price for the plot. She could take a room in town. There was always work for a woman who was willing to cook or sew or keep house for someone who could afford a house worth keeping. He said all of this while Zosha stood in the doorway behind her mother, one hand resting on the frame near her father's carved name, listening. Mara thanked him for his concern. She said she would think about it. When he left, she did not think about it. That night, after Zosha was asleep, Mara went down into the root cellar beneath the cabin, a low earthen space that smelled of cold and old wood and something else, something she couldn't name at first. She was looking for the preserves Alexei had stored before the accident. She found those. She also found something she had not expected, a notebook. It was small and water-stained, bound in oilcloth, sitting on a shelf as if it had been placed there deliberately. The previous occupant of the cabin, a Norwegian miner named Eriksson, who had built the original structure and died in it before Alexei bought the land, had left it behind. She had known vaguely that someone had lived here before. She had not known he had left a record. She brought the notebook upstairs and sat by the stove and read it by lamplight while the wind tested the walls. Most of it was practical. Observations about the land, the angle of the slope where water collected in spring. Notes about timber and stone and the behavior of frost. The handwriting was precise and patient, the handwriting of someone who had learned English carefully and used it with respect. The last page was different. The ink was slightly smeared as if written in haste or cold. 3 lines only. The bark knows. I was too proud to listen in time. And below that, a name. Silas. Just that. No last name. No explanation. And below the name, 3 words that made no sense to her yet. He will understand. Mara sat with the notebook for a long time. The fire settled. The wind found a new gap somewhere and sang a low, tuneless note through it. Zosha coughed once in the back room and then went quiet. She looked up at the highest shelf where the tin box sat, the one she had also found in the cellar, the one she had not yet opened, because something about the weight of it told her it was not the right time. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked away. She closed the notebook. She looked at the walls. She put her palm flat against the nearest log, the way you might press your hand against the forehead of a child you are worried about, and she felt the cold seeping through, patient and methodical the way all serious things are patient. And she heard in the back of her mind a voice that had been quiet for years, her grandfather's voice, low and certain the way the forest is certain, speaking in the language she had grown up inside, the one that still lived in the part of her that dreamed. "The tree does not fight the cold," he said. "It wears a coat and waits." She took her hand off the wall. She looked at the forest, and something that had been folded up very small inside her chest slowly, carefully began to open. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She only knew she was not going to sign anything. She was not going to sell. She was not going to let the mathematics of this winter be the end of the story. Alexi's name was on the doorframe. Zosha's lungs were already fragile, and somewhere on the highest shelf, a tin box held a letter written by a dead man to a person named Silas, who apparently understood something that no one else in this valley did. The cold pressed in from every direction. Mara Weston pressed back. She started with the dead trees. That was the first thing, not the living ones. She was not foolish enough to strip bark from living birch and leave the wood exposed to rot. She walked the tree line at the edge of the property in the early morning before Zosha woke, before the town below had fully stirred, and she looked for the fallen ones, the ones that had already given up standing, the ones whose bark was still intact but whose heartwood had begun to soften, the ones that had been down long enough to be useful, but not so long that the bark had fused to the decay beneath. She found 7 in the first hour, 14 by mid-morning. The work of peeling bark from a fallen birch is not delicate work. It requires a specific kind of stubbornness, the kind that does not respond to pain or cold, or the sound of its own breathing growing ragged. Mara used Alexi's draw knife, a tool she had watched him use 100 times, and handled herself perhaps twice. She made a long vertical cut with the hatchet first scoring through the outer layer without cutting into the wood beneath. Then she worked the flat blade of the draw knife into the seam and pulled. The bark came away in long pale sheets, cream-colored on the inside, papery and dense. Each piece was nearly half an inch thick where the tree had grown well. She stacked them flat under rocks to keep them from curling. As they dried, weighted at the corners, laid out in rows, along the south-facing slope where the weak autumn sun could reach them. Zosha came out at mid-morning wrapped in her coat and her father's scarf, which was too long and dragged slightly in the frost. She watched for a moment without speaking. Then she picked up a piece of bark from the nearest stack and turned it over in her hands, examining it the way children examine things they have decided are interesting. "It's like paper," she said. "It's better than paper," Mara said without looking up from the seam she was working. "Paper burns, paper tears. This," she pulled a long section free with both hands, the sound of it like a slow exhale. "This kept the tree alive for 60 years. Zosha considered this. She set the piece back on the stack carefully, the way she had seen her mother do it. Then she picked up a smaller piece from the ground and began carrying it to the end of the row. She did not ask if she could help. She simply helped. That was Zosha's way. They worked until the light went thin and the cold sharpened into something with an edge, and then they went inside and ate what there was, which was not much, and Mara fed the stove with 2 pieces of wood instead of 3, and told herself this was a choice and not a necessity, even though it was both. The town noticed within 3 days. It was not possible to do unusual things in a small town without the town forming an opinion about them. Men driving wagons to the mill slowed as they passed the slope above, squinting up at the pale stacked sheets laid out in rows at the widow on her ladder with a draw knife and an expression that did not invite conversation. Women coming back from the general store paused at the bottom of the path and looked up and said things to each other in low voices. The opinion the town formed was not a generous one. Silas Drummond was the one who gave it a name. He did this on a Tuesday morning, standing in front of the general store with 3 men from the mill loud enough to be heard by anyone passing. He had come to look, he said. He had heard the widow Weston was doing something with bark up on the slope, and he had wanted to see for himself, because a man in his position had a responsibility to know when a potential fire hazard was developing within the town's boundaries. He looked up at the slope. He looked at the cabin with its first layer of bark pieces nailed horizontally along the base of the north wall, overlapping like rough shingles sealed at every seam with a dark line of rendered pine pitch. "Mara's madness," he said. The men around him laughed. The name spread the way names spread in small places without effort, without anyone deciding to spread it. By the end of the week, it was simply what the project was called. A group of young men started a wager. They wrote the terms on a scrap of paper and tacked it to the post outside the grain store. The question was simple: on what date would the widow abandon the project? The earliest guess was 2 weeks. The most generous allowed her until the first snow. Nobody picked a date after that because nobody seriously believed she would still be working after the first snow. Mara heard about the wager from Zosha, who had heard it from a girl at the well who had told it as a funny story, not understanding that Zosha was the widow's daughter. Zosha came home and told her mother with a matter-of-fact expression that gave nothing away. Mara listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, "What was the earliest date?" Zosha told her. "That was 4 days ago," Mara said. "Yes," said Zosha. They looked at each other. "Go get your coat," Mara said. "We have more bark to bring down." But before the bark, before the next wall, before any of that, there was the night Mara nearly lost her. It came without warning the way the worst things do. Zosha had been fine at supper, quieter than usual, but she was often quiet. It was not a flag Mara had learned to read correctly yet. She had eaten her share of the cornmeal and drunk her cup of willow bark tea, the mild kind, the preventative kind, and she had gone to bed without complaint. Mara woke at some hour deep in the night to a sound that rearranged every priority she had. It was breathing. But wrong. Shallow and rapid and catching like something small trying to find purchase on a steep slope. She crossed the cabin in 4 steps. Zosha was burning. That was the only word for it. Her skin had gone past warm and past feverish into something that felt like touching a stone that had been left too close to the fire. Her chest rose and fell too fast. Her eyes, when they opened, were glassy and unfocused. Mara did not panic. She had learned somewhere in the years of being a person who could not afford to panic. How to move through fear the way you move through deep water, deliberately, without thrashing, preserving every bit of energy for what actually needed doing. 3 matches left in the tin. She used the first one to light the lamp. The second to start the tinder in the stove. The third she kept. The wood was nearly out. She used the last of what was stacked by the door, and then she went to the corner where she had not yet admitted to herself she was keeping the wood for true emergencies, and she took from there. While the stove climbed toward useful heat, she worked. Her grandfather had taught her about fever the way he had taught her everything, not as a lesson, but as a thing they did together. He had shown her which plants mattered and why had made her touch the leaves, so she would know them in the dark, had explained in his unhurried way that the body in fever is not sick so much as fighting, and what it needs is not to be stopped, but to be helped. Yarrow she had dried in late summer, hanging in bundles from the rafters of the old house before everything changed. She had thought to bring some. Not much. Enough. She made the tea strong and let it cool to the edge of warmth. She got Zosha upright against her arm and coaxed it in small sips, patient as the forest. She laid wet cloth on her forehead and her wrists. She kept the fire steady, not roaring, which would dry the air, but banked and constant a low even heat that filled the room without consuming it. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hand on Zosha's back, feeling the rise and fall of it, counting. When the count slowed toward something more like rest, she did not relax. She kept counting. She would keep counting until the sky lightened and she could see her daughter's face clearly and know that the color in it was the right kind. The sky lightened. The color was the right kind. Zosha's eyes opened clear this time, and she looked at her mother with the direct, calm gaze of a child who has been somewhere frightening and come back and is not yet sure how to talk about it. "Am I better?" she asked. "You're better," Mara said. Zosha looked at the window where pale morning was beginning. She looked at the stove, which was glowing. She looked at her mother, who had not moved from the edge of the bed, whose eyes had the particular flatness of someone who has been awake doing hard things for many hours. "You didn't sleep," Zosha said. "I wasn't tired," Mara said. Zosha looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said with the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, "Papa used to say you were the strongest person he knew." Mara did not answer. She looked at the window. The forest at the edge of the property was beginning to emerge from the dark, pale birch trunks, appearing out of the gray like quiet witnesses. She whispered it so softly that Zosha may not have heard. "We wear the coat," she said, "and we wait." Then she stood up and put more wood on the fire and started heating water because there was a day to begin, and she was not a woman who let mornings go to waste. Rex arrived on a Thursday. He was not supposed to arrive at all. He was not, by any reasonable standard, a dog anyone would choose, large and disreputable looking, with a coat the color of old ash and one ear that sat differently from the other, as though it had made a decision the rest of him had not been consulted about. He had been living at the edge of the refuse pile at the bottom of the hill, which was where he had been left by the previous family that moved on without him, and he had apparently decided at some point on that particular Thursday that he had been patient enough. He appeared at the edge of the property and sat down and looked at Zosha. Zosha looked back. "No," said Mara from the ladder where she was fitting the second course of bark against the east wall. Zosha said nothing. She simply continued to look at the dog. The dog continued to look at her. This went on for longer than Mara found comfortable. "We don't have enough food," Mara said. Zosha looked at the dog's ribs, which were visible in the way of a creature that had also been calculating its food situation carefully. "Neither does he," Zosha said. The dog, as though sensing the conversation had reached a critical juncture, lay down and placed his large graying head on his front paws and sighed. It was a sigh of such profound and practiced patience that even Mara felt it. She climbed down from the ladder. She looked at the dog. The dog looked up at her without lifting his head, only his eyes moving, measuring. "If he stays," she said, "he works. He's not a decoration." "He can be a guardian," Zosha said immediately, as though she had already thought through this entire arrangement and was simply waiting for permission to implement it. Mara looked at her daughter. She looked at the dog. She went back up the ladder. Rex stood up. walked to the corner of the cabin nearest the path, turned twice, and lay down facing outward. He did not move from that position for the rest of the day, except to eat the small portion of cornmeal Zosha brought him at supper, which he consumed with great dignity and apparent gratitude. That night, he slept across the threshold of the cabin door. Nobody had asked him to. It was Henrik Brandt who told her about the ordinance. He came on a gray afternoon when the light was already thinning toward early dark. Mara was on the ladder, and she heard Rex issue a low sound, not aggressive but watchful, and she looked down to see a man she recognized from a distance but had never spoken to. The town's blacksmith. German by way of somewhere colder. A wide, quiet man with hands the size of small shovels and the particular stillness of someone who worked with intense heat and had learned not to be startled by anything. He stopped at the edge of the property line. Rex watched him. "I'm not here to argue with your project," he said. He had a careful way of speaking as though he selected each word the way a craftsman selects a tool for fitness, not decoration. "I'm here because you should know something." Mara came down from the ladder. Henrik Brandt told her what he had heard at the mill the previous day, that Silas Drummond had brought a proposal before the town council. A fire safety ordinance. Specific in its language about structures that used organic material as exterior cladding. Specific enough that there was only one structure in the entire valley it could possibly apply to. "He wrote it the day after he visited you," Henrik said. Mara absorbed this. She looked at the bark-covered wall behind her, the careful seams sealed with pine pitch, the horizontal overlapping that her grandfather had described as the same principle as scales on a fish or feathers on a wing, each piece protecting the one below it. "Does the council know it was written for me specifically?" she asked. "Some of them know," Henrik said. "None of them will say so." Rex had moved slightly closer to Henrik during this conversation, not aggressively, but with the quiet professional interest of someone monitoring a situation. Henrik glanced down at him. Rex glanced up. Some sort of assessment was made by both parties. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked. Henrik looked at her directly. "Because it isn't right," he said, as though this were a complete and sufficient answer, which from a man who chose his words the way he did, perhaps it was. He left before dark. He did not offer help. He did not promise anything. But something in the deliberate way he had come, not casually, not in passing, but with clear intention, settled in Mara's chest like a coal that gives off warmth long after the fire has died down. She thought about it that evening, while she worked at the table by lamplight, repairing the draw-knife's handle where it had started to loosen. She thought about it, and then she put it away because there was too much else to think about, and the fire needed another log. Zosha found the slate on a Saturday. She had been ranging along the creek bed the way she did when her energy was up and her curiosity was ahead of her caution, and she came back with a flat piece of pale gray stone, roughly the size of a large book, carried against her chest, with both arms moving carefully so as not to drop it. She laid it on the table with the gravity of someone presenting something of value. Mara looked at it. "What's this for?" "For my lessons," Zosha said, "so I don't forget how to read." Mara looked at the slate. She looked at her daughter. Zosha was watching her with that particular calm that was her way of asking for something without performing the asking a dignity Mara had always admired without knowing how to name it. She turned away before her face could do something she didn't want Zosha to see. "We'll need chalk," she said, her voice entirely steady. "I know where there's chalk stone," Zosha said. by the upper creek. Of course you do, Mara said. She stood at the window for a moment looking out at the birch trees. The forest edge had started to show color at the tips, not the rich blazing color of a good autumn, but the thin, exhausted gold of trees that had been through a hard summer and were letting go before they had to. She thought about a girl who found a piece of slate in a creek bed and called it schooling. She thought about what it meant to be 8 years old and understand without being told that knowledge was worth carrying even when everything else had to be left behind. She pressed one hand briefly against the window glass, feeling the cold on the other side. The tree does not fight the cold, she thought. Then she turned around and told Zosha to go get the chalkstone before the light failed. Old Seward came on a day when the first serious frost had turned the ground to iron. He lived at the edge of things, at the edge of the property line that bordered the forest, at the edge of conversations he was invited into, but rarely seemed to join, at the edge of old age, in the way of men who had decided not to rush toward it. He had been in the valley longer than anyone, except the mountains themselves, and he had the quality of very old, very particular knowledge, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He walked up the path with a stick and stood looking at Mara's work for a long time. She kept working. She had learned not to stop for observers. Stopping for observers implied she cared what they thought, and caring what observers thought cost energy she needed for other things. Old Syward walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, the way a man reads a map. He looked at the north wall. He looked at the angle of the eaves. He looked at the way the bark pieces overlapped and at the dark lines of pitch sealing the gaps. He stopped at the north wall and stood there for a moment. "North wall first," he said, not loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, in the way of a man who was perhaps speaking to himself. "Wind comes from the north. You've been starting from the south." Mara stopped. She thought about the prevailing wind direction. She thought about which wall had the most gaps that sang when the weather came in from the peaks. She thought about the 3 nights last week when the cold had come specifically from the north, and the east wall had held fine, and the north wall had leaked heat like a wound. She had been starting from the south because the south side was easier, better footing, better light, better access for the ladder. She had been starting from the wrong wall. Syward turned and walked back down the path without waiting to see if she had heard. She heard. The next morning she moved the ladder to the north wall. It was harder footing, worse light. The cold came off the mountain and hit the ladder side on. She worked anyway, faster than she had worked before, the way you work when you realize you have been working incorrectly and need to correct the error before pride convinces you it wasn't an error at all. The work of applying bark to a log wall is a conversation between the builder and the material. The bark has its own opinion about where it wants to go. It curls at the edges as it dries. It splits along lines of weakness that are invisible until the nail goes in wrong. Mara learned these things the way she had learned everything her grandfather taught her, by paying attention to what the material was telling her rather than insisting on what she had planned. She learned that the pitch had to be rendered at exactly the right heat too cool, and it spread thick and uneven too hot, and it turned brittle and cracked. She learned that the horizontal courses had to overlap by at least 2 inches, or the driving rain would find a path. She learned that the north wall required a 3rd layer in certain places where the wind came off the peak at an angle that found the seams between pieces. She learned all of this by doing it wrong first, and then doing it right. This was how her grandfather had taught her. You learn what a thing is by finding out what it refuses to be. The bark refused to be rushed. It refused to be forced into shapes it had not grown into. It agreed, however, to be patient, and patience was something Mara understood from the inside. There were mornings when the cold was so sharp, and the woodpile so diminished, and Zosha's cough so persistent that she stood at the base of the ladder for a long moment before climbing it. Not hesitating, just standing, taking the weight of the day on her feet before adding the weight of the work to it. On those mornings, she thought about her grandfather's forest, the way it was in winter when everything had drawn inward and gone quiet. People who did not know forests saw winter as a kind of death, a long ending. Her grandfather had seen it differently. He had told her once, standing in knee-deep snow among trees so old they had forgotten what it was to be young, the forest is not sleeping. It is deciding what it will be in the spring. All the work is happening below the surface, where you cannot see it. She thought about this on the difficult mornings. She thought about work happening below the surface where no one could see it. Then she climbed the ladder. The second time Henrik Brandt came, he did not come empty-handed. He left a set of tools at the edge of the property. She found them when she came down from the north wall at midday, a small tack hammer, 2 chisels of different widths, and a short pry bar, all of it laid in a neat row on the flat stone near the path. Every handle had been slightly modified, shaved thinner at the grip better balanced for a smaller hand. He was not there. There was no note. Zosha came to look at them with her. She picked up the small pry bar, tested its weight. "He changed the handles," she said. "I see that," Mara said. Zosha put the pry bar down and looked up the path toward where Henrik Brandt's forge sat at the edge of town, its chimney sending a straight line of smoke into the clear, cold air. Then she looked at her mother with the specific expression of a child who has noticed something an adult is pretending not to notice. Mara picked up the tack hammer. It fit her hand differently than Alexi's, had not better or worse, just differently. She turned it once, feeling the balance. She put it in her apron pocket and went back to the north wall. It was late afternoon, 2 weeks after she had begun, that Judge Hargrove came. He rode rather than walked, which was itself a statement. Men who rode to deliver news to women living a short slope above town were men who wanted their arrival to mean something. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post and came up the path with the particular walk of a man carrying something unpleasant that he has convinced himself he is delivering as a courtesy. He handed her the document without preamble. It was formal and correct in all its language. The fire safety ordinance had been passed. Her structure, as currently constituted, was in violation. She had 14 days to bring it into compliance, which in practical terms meant removing the bark cladding or pay a fine that he named with the careful neutrality of a man who knows the sum is impossible. She read it completely before she spoke. It was a habit she had kept from before, from when there had been documents worth reading carefully. She read every line. "Thank you," she said. "I'll review this." Hargrove nodded, once remounted his horse, and rode back down. The whole interaction took less than 3 minutes. Rex watched him go with professional attention until he was out of sight, then looked back at Mara. She folded the document. She put it in her coat pocket. She went inside. That evening, after Zosha was in bed, Mara sat at the table with the document and a piece of paper and a pencil, and she worked through the arithmetic with the methodical patience she brought to things that frightened her. The fine was more than she had. The alternative was tearing down what she had built, which would leave her with no insulation, no way to stretch the woodpile, and a daughter with weak lungs facing a winter that was already sharpening its edge against the peaks. She got up and went to the small box where she kept what money remained. She counted it. She sat back down. She picked up the pencil. She looked at the piece of paper. She had drafted in her mind what a sale offer for the land might look like. The number Drummond had suggested would cover the fine with something left over. There would be enough for a room in town, enough to keep Zosha warm. She wrote the first line. The pencil stopped. From the back room came Zosha's voice, soft with sleep, not quite awake. "Mama." "I'm here," Mara said. A pause. "Then Papa's name is on the doorframe. He carved it himself, didn't he?" A long silence. "Yes," Mara said. "He did." Another pause, shorter this time. Then Zosha's breathing returned to the slow rhythm of sleep. Mara sat at the table with the pencil in her hand and looked at the first line she had written, and then looked at the wall, and then at the ceiling. She put the pencil down. She folded the paper and put it in the box with the money, and closed the box, and pushed it to the back of the shelf. She picked up Henrik's tack hammer, which she had left on the table, and she turned it in her hands for a moment, feeling its balance, feeling the care that had gone into adjusting the grip. She put it down. She banked the fire for the night. She went to the door frame and ran her thumb across the letters, carved there rough and deliberate the way Alexei did everything, and then she went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind finding the gap it always found on the north wall, and she thought about what Henrik had told her. The ordinance written the day after Drummond's visit. The language specific enough to apply to exactly one structure. She thought about the notebook in the cellar. She thought about the last page. The bark knows. I was too proud to listen in time. Tell Silas. He will understand. She thought about the tin box on the high shelf and the letter inside it that she had not yet opened. She fell asleep thinking about it. And here is the thing about open questions: they do not wait for you to be ready. They sit in the dark and they pull the way cold pulls heat, the way winter pulls toward the warmth of a house that is not ready for it. The letter in the box was pulling, and the winter was coming. And Mara Weston lay in the dark of her half-finished, bark-wrapped, pitch-sealed, stubbornly standing cabin, and she breathed steadily, and she did not sign anything, and she did not give up. Not yet. Not tonight. But she did not yet know what Henrik would find when he dug deeper into the council records. She did not yet know what Drummond had done before, to someone else, in another season. She did not yet know that the man she was fighting had fought this fight before, and won. She did not know any of that. What she knew was the north wall, and the pitch, and the bark, and the hammer with the adjusted handle, and her daughter's voice saying her father's name in the dark. That was enough to get to morning. Morning was enough. Henrik came back on a morning when the sky could not decide what color it wanted to be. It had been gray for 3 days, not the soft gray of clouds gathering toward something, but the flat, suspended gray of a world holding its breath. Mara had been watching it the way her grandfather had taught her to watch weather, not for what it was doing, but for what it was about to do. And she did not like what she saw in it. The birch trees at the edge of the property had gone very still. The creek, audible from the north wall on most mornings, had gone quiet. Even Rex had shifted his sleeping position to face the mountain rather than the path, which he had never done before. She was thinking about all of this when she heard the footsteps on the path, and Rex stood but did not growl, which meant it was someone he had already decided about. Henrik Brandt came around the corner of the cabin carrying the notebook. She recognized it immediately. The oilcloth cover the particular way the binding had warped from being in a cold space for too long. She had let him take it several days before not asked him to take it, but watched him pick it up and turn to the last page and read the 3 lines there, and then look at her with an expression she couldn't read and ask if he could hold it a few days. She had said yes, without entirely knowing why. He held it out to her now, and his face had the quality it sometimes had closed in the way of a man who has found something he did not want to find, and is still deciding how to say it. "Sit down," Mara said, not unkindly. He sat on the low bench near the north wall. Rex lay back down at a careful angle that allowed him to monitor both the mountain and the newcomer simultaneously. Zosha was inside at her lessons, the scratch of chalk on slate audible through the wall. "I found the council records," Henrik said. "The old ones, from before Hargrove." Mara waited. Drummond used the same ordinance once before. He said it straight without preamble, which she had come to understand was his way when the thing being said was serious. Different woman, different season. Same language in the document, almost word for word. Fire safety. Organic material. 14 days. Mara was very still. "What happened to her?" she asked. "She sold." Henrik's jaw moved once the way it did when he was keeping something else in. "She had 2 children. She sold the land for less than it was worth, took a room in town, and was gone before the next frost. Nobody talks about it now. I had to find it in papers that hadn't been touched in years." The scratch of chalk continued from inside. Mara listened to it without looking toward the window. "He's done this before," she said, not a question. "You're not the first." He paused. "I don't think he knows I found this. He may not remember how much was written down." Mara looked at the notebook in her hands. At the last page. "The bark knows. I was too proud to listen in time. Tell Silas. He will understand." She had turned this over in her mind more times than she had told anyone. The name written below those words, Silas, sat in her chest, like something with weight, something she had not found a place to put yet. "There's something else," Henrik said. She looked up. He did not look away. "I'm going to stand with you at the hearing, whatever it costs me." He said it the way a man says a thing he has already argued with himself about for several sleepless nights, and arrived at as the only position he can hold, without losing something more important than contracts. "I should have said so sooner. I was—" He stopped, started again. "I was afraid, and I let that matter more than it should have." Mara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost a man in a place like this to admit he had been afraid. She thought about the adjusted handles on the hammer. She thought about a person who comes back. "I know," she said, simply. He nodded once. He stood. He looked at the north wall, which was nearly finished, now sealed and overlapped and solid. "You started from the north," he said. "Someone suggested it," she said. He almost smiled. He picked up his coat from where he had set it on the bench and walked back down the path, and Rex watched him go with something that had shifted from monitoring to something closer to mild approval. Mara held the notebook and stood at the corner of the cabin and looked at the sky. It was still the wrong color. That afternoon, Rex stopped eating. He had never in all the weeks since Zosha had brought him home from the refuse pile refused food. He was a dog who had known hunger in a serious way and treated every meal with corresponding gravity. When Zosha brought his portion at midday, and he turned his head away and stood up and walked to the edge of the property and stood there, looking at the mountain. She came inside immediately and told her mother. Mara went out and stood beside him. The mountain looked the same as it always did. The sky was still that suspended, breathless gray. But something had changed in the quality of the air, a pressure in it, a density, the kind of atmospheric shift that has no name in ordinary language, because ordinary language developed in places where this specific thing did not happen with this specific intensity. She knew this feeling. She had felt it once before as a girl standing beside her grandfather at the edge of a forest clearing in a place far from here. He had taken her hand and said nothing. He had simply pointed at the sky, the exact same color, the exact same bruised flat quality, and then pointed at the tree line where every bird that had been in the canopy moments before was gone. She had asked him where they went. He had said they went where they knew to go. And then he had said the thing she had never forgotten, the thing that had lived in her body all these years like a second heartbeat. When the sky turns that color, you have 2 hours, not 3, 2. She stood at the edge of the property and looked at the sky. She had perhaps 1 hour left of the 2. She went inside. "Zosha," she said in the voice she used when there was no time for questions. "Everything we have that we cannot replace books, the tin box, your slate, the notebook, the food stores. Move it all to the center of the cabin. Stack it against the interior wall, not the outer ones. Then bring in the extra wood from the lean-to. All of it." Zosha looked at her mother's face and did not ask a single question. She put down the chalk and stood up and began. Mara went to find her coat. She went to every house. This was the part of the story that would be told later in the way that the difficult parts of stories get told with discomfort, with pauses, with the particular heaviness of people describing something they wish had gone differently. She went to every house on the 2 main streets of the town, and she knocked, and when the door opened, she said the same thing with calm and clarity, that something was coming, that the sky was a color. She recognized that they had perhaps an hour to prepare. At the first house, they listened politely and thanked her for her concern. At the second, the woman of the house said she would mention it to her husband. At the grain store where 3 men were talking, one of them laughed. Not meanly just the automatic laugh of someone encountering something unexpected. He caught himself and tried to turn it into a cough, which did not work. At the house with the blue door near the mill, she was told that animals don't predict weather, that whatever the dog was doing was probably related to what dogs normally did, which was difficult to predict at the best of times. She kept going. At one house near the end of the street, the last before the general store, a woman opened the door and looked at Mara for a long moment without speaking. She was older, with the particular face of someone who had lived through enough winters to know what they cost. She looked at the sky. She looked back at Mara. She did not say anything, but she stepped back inside, and Mara heard faintly the sound of furniture being moved, heavy things being shifted away from the outer walls toward the center of the room. Mara did not know the woman's name. She kept walking, but that sound stayed with her. One person, one quiet, private preparation. It was enough to keep her moving toward the next house. At the church, the Reverend came out onto the step and looked at the sky with her. He was a serious man who took his responsibilities seriously, and she thought for a moment that he was going to hear her. He stood there for a full minute looking up at that flat, suspended gray. Then he said gently that only Providence knew the hour of storms. She moved on. Drummond was standing outside the general store. He had not been there by accident. He was a man who positioned himself, who understood how presence communicated power. He watched her coming down the street with an expression that did not change as she approached. She stopped in front of him. She said what she had been saying. The sky. The color. An hour, perhaps less. He looked at the sky. He looked back at her. And then he said it loudly enough for the small cluster of people near the store entrance to hear clearly. The bark woman, he said, is afraid of her own shadow. There was laughter. Not cruel laughter, the social laughter of people who need someone to tell them what to feel about an ambiguous situation. It was worse than cruelty in its way, because it did not require anyone to mean anything by it. Mara looked at him. She had stood in enough doorways in her life to know when a door had fully closed. This was one of those moments. There was nothing more to say to this man, not because she had no words, but because no words she had would reach him, not today, not in this street, not in front of these people whose approval he needed more than he needed to be right. She had spent months building something he could not see. The storm would have to do the seeing for her. She turned and walked back toward the slope. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Bellamy say something about the widow's state of mind. She heard more laughter softening as she moved away from it. At the edge of the street, in the shadow of the building where the council met, she passed old Seward sitting on a low step. He was not going anywhere. He was not preparing anything. He sat with his stick across his knees and his coat buttoned to the throat, and he looked at her as she passed. He did not speak. He simply nodded once, the same single nod she had seen before. Slow and deliberate, the nod of a man acknowledging something that requires acknowledging. She nodded back. She kept walking. Rex met her at the edge of the property. He had moved from the fence line back to the cabin door, which she understood immediately. She went straight inside and bolted the door. 20 minutes later, the wind arrived. It came from the mountain, which was where it always came from in the stories her grandfather had told her, the ones she had listened to as a child. With the half attention of someone who does not yet understand that stories about survival are instructions. It came from the mountain, and it came fast, the way a fast thing moves when it has been gathering for a long time, not gradually, but in a single committed surge. And then it was simply there. And the world was a different place than it had been. The sound of it against the bark-wrapped walls was not what she expected. She had expected howling. She had expected the sounds she had heard through the gaps in the old chinking, the shrieking, the fingers in the cracks, sound of wind finding every weakness. She had expected the cabin to vibrate and shudder the way it had last winter when she and Alexei had lain awake listening to it like two people on the inside of a drum. Instead, there was a deepness, a muffled, layered quality, the way sound changes when it passes through something dense, the way a voice changes when it comes through a closed door. The wind was there. It was loud. But it was outside in a way that the cabin had never before managed to be inside of. The candle on the table did not move. Zosha stood in the middle of the room, perfectly still, and watched it. She watched the small flame for a long moment, waiting for it to flicker, and it did not flicker, and something in her face changed a quiet recognition, the face of someone who has just understood a proof. "It's warm," she said. "It's holding," Mara said. Rex lay down by the stove and crossed his front paws. He exhaled a long, decisive sound and closed his eyes. Mara went to the inner wall and pressed her palm flat against it, the way her grandfather had pressed her palm against the bark of an old linden tree in the deep cold, and told her to feel what she felt. The log was cool, not cold. Not the biting, sucking cold she remembered from every winter of her marriage in this same cabin. Cool the way a stone is cool in a shaded place temperature without malice. Outside, something struck the roof. Something else larger struck the ground near the lean-to. Zosha came to stand beside her mother. She pressed her own small palm against the wall. "It's like the tree," she said softly. "Yes," Mara said. "It's exactly like the tree." They stood together for a moment, hands against the wall, while the storm assembled itself outside with the unhurried confidence of something that had not been asked for permission and did not require it. Then Zosha coughed once, twice, and Mara moved them both away from the wall and back toward the warmth of the stove. And she put the kettle on and found the yarrow she had been rationing, and she made the tea. The fire needed only 2 logs. Just 2. The first knock came in the deep part of the night. Mara was not asleep. She had been sitting near the stove with her coat on, listening, because there was a quality to the storm that told her it was not finished introducing itself. Rex lifted his head from his paws a moment before she heard it. His ears moving, tilting the old dog's instinct still intact where his body had gone gray. Then she heard it. A knock. Faint under the sound of the wind, but deliberate. Not debris. Someone was at the door. She opened the door. The family from the house with the blue door near the mill. The father and mother and 2 children, the youngest, pressed against her mother's side, with her face the chalky pale of someone who had been in real cold for too long. Behind them, above the roofline of their house at the bottom of the slope, she could see in the brief, bright moment before she stepped back to let them in that the roof had gone. "Come in," Mara said. "Get warm." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. They came in. The youngest child went straight to Rex without any particular decision about it. Small children find dogs in the dark the way water finds cracks, and Rex received her with the stillness of an old creature who understands what it is to need something to hold on to. Mara got them near the stove. She got blankets. She heated what broth she had, stretching it with water and the last of the dried beans she had been saving. And she did not think about what she was spending, because there was no point in thinking about it. More knocks came. The store owner, alone without his coat, which meant the situation at his house was worse than it appeared, because a man does not leave his coat behind in a storm unless the decision was made for him. He came in without speaking. He sat down in the corner nearest the door and looked at his hands, which were the white gray of hands that had been very cold for longer than was safe. Mara knew about this kind of cold from her grandfather. She got the warmest water she had from the kettle not boiling warm, and she brought it in a basin and set it near the man's hands, not on them, and told him to hold his hands above the steam. He looked up at her with an expression that had something bewildered in it, the look of a man whose categories for this woman were not adequate to the moment, and did as she said. The reverend whose church had lost 2 windows came with 3 families who had been sheltering there and found it no longer sheltering. He came in quietly and stood to one side and watched Mara move through the crowded cabin. Judge Hargrove came next. He had lost his hat, and his coat was torn at the shoulder, and he looked smaller than he did in daylight, the way authority always looks smaller when the thing that maintains it has been stripped away. He stood in the doorway and looked at Mara, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment about the document he had handed her, about the 14 days, about the fine that was more than she had. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. The cabin was full now in a way that should have been impossible. The floor space taken the bench, taken the corners, claimed children tucked into whatever geometry of human bodies would hold them. Rex surrounded by small hands, and apparently at peace with this. The small fire in the stove was working quietly, and without drama, warming the massive bodies and the heavy log walls, those walls that had drunk in weeks of gentle heat, and were now releasing it slowly back into the room like interest on a careful investment. The room was not hot. It was simply stubbornly, persistently not cold. No one who had been inside other buildings in the valley that night would have believed it without standing in it. The last knock was different. It came alone sometime after the others when the storm was at the height of what it intended to do. One knock and then silence, and then another, as though the person knocking was not entirely in control of the force they were applying. Mara went to the door. She opened it, and Silas Drummond stood in the dark. He was alone. His coat was there, buttoned hat gone. And in the brief light of the open door, she could see that his face had been rearranged by the night into something she had not seen in it before. Not guilt, not quite, but something in the same territory. Something like a man who has been arguing with himself in a very cold place for long enough that the argument is finished. He said nothing. He simply stood. Behind Mara, in the packed warmth of the small cabin, she felt Zosha appear at her side. She had not asked Zosha to come. Zosha simply came the way she came to the things that mattered, quiet and deliberate, and already decided. Zosha looked up at Drummond. He looked down at her. In the gray light of the storm, the man and the child regarded each other, the most powerful builder in the valley and the 8-year-old girl who had been carrying a piece of slate through a creek bed and calling it education. Then Zosha stepped to one side, just one step, opening the space in the doorway. She did not speak. She did not gesture. She simply moved in the ancient, uncomplicated way of someone doing the thing that is right because it is right and for no other reason. Drummond stepped inside. "Come in." Mara said, her voice exactly the same as it had been for every other person who had knocked. "Get warm." He moved to the far corner of the room near the wall that was farthest from the stove. He did not take a seat that might have belonged to someone else. He did not impose himself on the arrangement of the room. He simply stood and looked around at what Mara had built, the ceiling that was holding the walls, that were holding the warmth that was holding, and his face did what it was going to do. Then he saw the tin box. It was on the highest shelf, exactly where it had been since she found it in the cellar. The battered lid, the particular dimensions of it, the small dent on the left corner. Something about seeing it from across a crowded room from a specific angle in lamplight caused him to stop moving entirely. His color changed. She watched it happen. She watched the certainty drain out of his face, the way it drains from a place when the light shifts, not all at once, but in the specific sequence in which it leaves. First the jaw, Then around the eyes. Then something deeper. Something structural. He knew that box. He knew it the way you know something that has existed in your mind as a fixed point of loss for a very long time, something you stopped expecting to see because you had made your peace with never seeing it. He recognized it before she had any reason to move toward the shelf, before she said a word. She watched him recognize it, and she watched what recognition did to him, and she understood in the way she sometimes understood things all at once completely, that the answer to the question she had been carrying since the cellar, since the notebook's last page, since the name written below those 3 lines, was standing in the corner of her cabin wearing the expression of a man whose defenses have been removed by something he did not expect. She did not take the box down. Not yet. This was not the moment. There were 19 people in the cabin, and the storm had not finished, and Zosha's tea needed refreshing, and there were hands still too cold, and people still too frightened, and she was the person who knew what to do about all of those things. She turned away from the shelf. She went back to the fire. But the box was there, and Drummond knew it was there. And somewhere in the long hours of that brutal, howling night, the answer to the mystery that had begun in a cellar with a dead man's notebook was waiting to be said aloud. That hour was coming. The night had weight. Not just the cold was outside now, held at the walls, the way a flood is held at a levee, present and patient, and looking for the seam that wasn't there. What had weight was the particular heaviness of 19 people in a small space, each carrying what the storm had done to them, none of them yet sure what came next. Mara moved through it the way she moved through everything without wasting motion. She organized the floor space the way her grandfather had organized the forest shelter he sometimes used, which was not randomly, but by need. Those who were wettest nearest the stove. Children first. The elderly man from the mill road whose hands were still wrong-colored, seated on the low bench with the basin of steam water nearby. The family from the Blue Door house, arranged in the corner that caught the most radiated heat from the log walls, the youngest child still pressed against Rex's flank with a trusting, unconscious certainty of small animals seeking warmth. She distributed what she had with the mathematics of someone who has thought carefully about scarcity. The broth stretched across every person who needed it, which was everyone. The blankets and extra clothing, the things she had packed against the interior wall when Zosha moved the stores, the preparation that had seemed like anxiety and turned out to be foresight, passed from hand to hand without comment. Drummond remained in the far corner. He did not ask for anything. He did not take anything that was offered unless it was offered directly to him, and even then, he took it with the minimalism of a man who is aware of taking up space he has not been given permission to take. He did not look at the tin box again after that first recognition. But she knew. He knew it was there the way you know a sound is present even when you stop hearing it, by the quality of the silence around it. The Reverend helped without being asked, which surprised her. He moved carefully around the crowded floor, checking on the children, saying quiet things to the frightened ones, useful things, rather than abstract ones, the kind of pastoral attention that is less about doctrine and more about presence. She noted this without comment. Judge Hargrove sat with his torn coat and said nothing to anyone. He drank the broth when it was given to him. He looked at the walls. The cabin contained multitudes that night that it had no right to contain. 19 people in a space built for 3. And yet the walls held their warmth, the heavy logs releasing the heat they had accumulated over weeks of careful fire, slow and steady and unhurried the way a stone releases the warmth of a summer afternoon long after the sun has set. Mara understood, moving through that crowded room, what her grandfather had meant when he said that a good shelter is not just a structure. It is an argument. An argument that the cold can be met with intelligence rather than brute force. That the wisest thing in winter is not the biggest fire, but the thickest coat. She had made that argument in bark and pitch and pine resin one horizontal course at a time, working from the wrong wall before she learned to work from the right one. And the argument had held. Outside, the storm continued its long argument with the valley. The boy did not speak. He was 6 years old, the son of the family from the Blue Door house, and since the moment his father had pulled him from beneath the fallen section of roof, not fallen entirely, but close enough that the distinction had not helped, he had been entirely silent. Not the silence of sleep, not the silence of calm. The silence of a place inside a person that has closed its door and is not yet ready to open it. He sat near Rex, but not touching. He had moved progressively closer over the course of the hours, the way cautious things move without acknowledging the movement, each increment small enough to maintain deniability. Rex had not moved. He lay with his gray muzzle on his front paws, and breathed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a creature practicing patience, and he did not try to close the distance the boy was maintaining. He simply remained. It was Zosha who understood what was needed. She came and sat on the floor near Rex, not between the boy and the dog, but beside them both, at an angle that included everyone without demanding anything. She put her own hand on Rex's back lightly. She did not look at the boy. She looked at Rex the way you look at a thing you are demonstrating rather than the person you are demonstrating it for. Rex's tail moved once, just once. The slow, weighted movement of a tail that belongs to a dog who learned long ago not to spend enthusiasm carelessly. The boy watched this. A minute passed, perhaps 2. The storm made its sounds outside. Someone across the room coughed. The stove ticked. Then the boy reached out and put one finger against Rex's shoulder. Rex exhaled long and slow, the sound of a creature releasing something held. The boy's hand flattened. All 5 fingers. His palm against the warm, living side of the old dog, feeling the rise and fall of breathing that was steady and calm and completely indifferent to the storm. Something in the boy's face moved. Something in his chest moved. The silence in him cracked open the way ice cracks, not shattering, but finding the fracture that was already there. He cried, not loudly, quietly and completely, the way children cry when they have been holding it long enough that the holding itself has become exhausting. He cried, and Rex did not move away from him, and Zosha did not look at him, and his mother was across the room, and heard, and came. And the room grew very quiet, in the way that rooms grow quiet when something true is happening in them. When it was over, the boy wiped his face on his sleeve and looked at Rex and said in a small and perfectly ordinary voice, "Can I keep petting him?" "Yes," Zosha said. He petted the dog. Rex bore it with dignity. Across the room, more than one adult found something important to look at on the floor. The night moved toward its deepest part, the hours past midnight when the dark has fully committed to itself and the world is at its most tired. People slept in pieces in the way of people who are not safe enough for full sleep, but exhausted enough to take what comes. Children slept more fully, as children do the fundamental trust of small bodies that someone else is keeping watch. Mara kept watch. She fed the fire at intervals, the careful, measured way, 2 logs at a time, never more, because the walls had taken over the work of retention, and the fire's job now was supplementary rather than primary. She checked on the man with the cold hands every hour. She refreshed Zosha's tea. Zosha's fever had come back up near midnight, climbing with the quiet insistence of something that has not been fully addressed. Mara felt it in the forehead and in the shallow, quick quality of the breathing, and she did what she had done before. The yarrow, the measured warmth, the patience. What she had less of this time was the resource of being alone. Being alone with a sick child means the full weight of attention on one thing. Being responsible for 18 others meant the attention had to divide. She divided it. She sat on the edge of Zosha's pallet and kept one hand on her daughter's back and kept the other part of her awareness distributed across the room, the breathing patterns, the temperature of the space, the small sounds that meant someone needed something. She began to sing. It was not a decision. It was simply what came when she was tired and frightened and needed to do something for Zosha that did not require her hands. The song was old, older than she was older than her mother had been when she taught it, moving back through generations of women sitting beside sick children in cold rooms doing exactly this. It was Polish in its bones, but not in a way that required understanding the words. The meaning was in the shape of it, the rise and fall of the melody, the way it moved through the body of the singer as much as through the air. She sang it quietly, just above a whisper, her hand on Zosha's back. The room shifted around her as she sang, not dramatically. The way rooms shift when something changes the quality of the air, a small movement of attention, people who were sleeping lightly surfacing part way, and then settling again, drawn by the sound into something steadier. Drummond in the far corner became very still. She did not notice this at first because she was watching Zosha, but in the slow fourth repetition of the melody, she became aware that Drummond had stopped the small adjustments of position that people make in the night, that he had gone still in a way that was different from sleep. She glanced at him. His head was down, not in sleep, in the way of a man holding something inside that requires holding. His shoulders had the tension of effort of a person doing work that is not visible from the outside. She returned her attention to Zosha and kept singing. Later, she did not know how much later he spoke. Not to her, not to anyone in particular. He spoke in the way of a man who has been holding something in a closed room for long enough that the room has run out of air. Erickson used to hum that, he said. His voice was low. Most of the room was asleep. He was not speaking to the room. He was speaking to the floor in front of him, or to the past, or to some version of himself that existed before a long series of choices had added up to this corner on this night. Mara stopped singing. She waited. He called it the fisherman's song, Drummond said. He said all the northern peoples had a version of it, that it probably started somewhere no one could remember and traveled with the people when they traveled. He paused. He taught it to me when I was young. I hadn't thought about it in years. Mara looked at the tin box on the high shelf. Drummond's eyes followed hers, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not look away from it. You know who wrote what's inside, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he said. The fire settled. Someone across the room breathed slowly in sleep. Rex, who had positioned himself at some point in the night so that part of him was touching the boy and part of him was touching Zosha's feet, did not stir. Mara stood and crossed the room and took the tin box from the shelf. She brought it back and sat across from Drummond and opened it. The letter was inside, folded the way careful people fold things meant to be kept precisely with attention to the corners. She held it out. He took it. His hands were not entirely steady. He opened it slowly with the specific care of someone who suspects that what is inside has been waiting for him and is not sure he was ready to be found. He read it. She watched his face. The letter was not long. Whatever Erickson had written, it did not require many words. The kind of man who had left 3 lines at the end of a notebook was not a man who wrote at length. She had read it herself weeks ago in the small hours after Zosha was asleep, read it and understood only part of it, the part that was about the bark method, the testing the 3 winters of proof. The part she hadn't understood was the part that required knowing things she didn't know about a man named Silas. Drummond reached the end. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, without looking up from the paper, "He taught me everything. When I first came to this country, I had nothing, no English, no reputation, not a single contact who owed me anything. Erickson had been here longer. He took me in. He taught me the craft properly, not the shortcuts, but the principles." A pause. He also tried to teach me the bark method. He had developed it himself over years of observation. He was convinced it was the correct approach for this climate. "But you didn't use it," Mara said. "I decided it looked insufficient." He said the word as though he had found it after searching through worse ones. Rough. It looked like something a desperate person would do, not something a craftsman would do. I wanted to build things that looked like they belonged in a serious country. So I used milled timber and conventional chinking, and I built what everyone expected a house to look like. He set the letter on his knee. And then Erickson died alone in a cabin that stayed warm because he had wrapped it himself, and I built 30 houses in this valley that leak heat like broken windows, and I told a widow her bark-covered cabin was a fire hazard because I could not find a way to admit what I had known for years. The room was very quiet. "He wrote to me," Drummond said. "The letter never arrived. I assumed he had just not written, that he had forgotten about our disagreement or decided it wasn't worth addressing. I didn't know he had written until you opened that box." Mara looked at him. She looked at the man who had called her Project Madness, who had written an ordinance with her name in invisible ink at the bottom of it, who had tried before with another woman in another season and had won that time. She looked at him holding a dead man's letter in the lamplight of a cabin built with the method his pride had refused, surrounded by people his certainty had endangered. She was not without anger. She had not arrived at this night without anger. But what she felt looking at him was something more complex than anger. A kind of exhausted recognition, the feeling of seeing clearly, something you would have preferred to remain obscure. "He believed in you," she said. "He wrote your name because he thought you would understand." Drummond said nothing. She took the letter back and folded it with the same care Erickson had used and put it back in the tin box, and put the tin box on the shelf where it had always been. In the gray hour before dawn, Mrs. Bellamy spoke. She had been in the room all night. She had come with the Reverend's group, having been at the church when the windows went. She was a small woman whose talent for being heard across distances had always struck Mara as somewhat disproportionate to her size. She had spent most of the night in a corner near the south wall, not sleeping exactly, but not awake in any useful way either. The woman beside her, the mother from the Blue Door house, may or may not have been fully awake when Mrs. Bellamy began to speak. She spoke in a low voice, the voice of someone not entirely certain they intended to say what they were saying. She talked about her daughter. Mara was near the stove with her back to that corner, and she heard without planning to. She heard about a daughter taken by a system that ran on words, on what people said, on what neighbors confirmed, on the accumulated weight of a community's opinion brought to bear on a woman who had not managed to be what was expected of her. She heard about words that had been contributed to that machinery by a person who had thought they were only talking. Mrs. Bellamy's voice remained low. She did not say she was sorry. She did not use those words. What she said was smaller and more honest than that she said she had not thought at the time that talking was doing anything. She had not understood until much later that talk was the mechanism by which these things operated, that without the talking, the machinery could not turn. Then she was quiet. Mara stood at the stove with her back to the corner, and she held what she had heard for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. Then she went to the corner with a folded blanket and set it across Mrs. Bellamy's shoulders without speaking. Mrs. Bellamy looked up at her. Mara met her eyes for one moment, not warmly and not coldly, with the simple directness of a person acknowledging another person. Then she turned and went back to Zosha. Zosha's fever broke an hour before the sky began to lighten. Mara felt it happen, the subtle change in the quality of the skin under her hand, the shift from the dry, papery heat of real fever into the damp, exhausted warmth of a body that has finished fighting and won. She felt it, and she sat very still for a moment with her hand on her daughter's back and did not move. Rex, from his position at Zosha's feet, lifted his head. He made a sound low and brief, somewhere between a sigh and a word, and then laid his head back down, and his tail moved twice on the floor. Zosha opened her eyes. They were clear. She looked at her mother with the calm, direct gaze that was her particular way of arriving back from wherever sleep had taken her. "The storm," she said. "Still going," Mara said. "But we're all right." Zosha looked around the room at the sleeping shapes at Rex at her feet, at the steady fire at the walls that had held through the night. She did not seem surprised. She seemed instead the way she sometimes seemed, as though she was simply confirming what she had already understood. "How many people?" she asked. 19, Mara said. Zosha took this in. Then she looked at her mother's face, at the particular quality of a face that has been awake for many hours, doing hard things, and has not complained about any of them. "You should sleep," Zosha said. "Someone has to watch the fire," Mara said. "Henrik is awake," Zosha said. Mara looked across the room. Henrik Brandt was sitting against the east wall, not asleep, watching the fire with the patient attention of a man who was accustomed to keeping watch over things that required consistent tending. He met her eyes across the space of the room. He nodded once. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the tools with the adjusted handles. She thought about a man who came back. She thought about a nod that meant something different from old Seward's nod, not the nod of a witness, but the nod of a person who is present in a particular way, by choice, for a particular reason. She moved to the wall and leaned against it and let her eyes close for a while. Henrik watched her from across the room with an expression she did not have time to examine. She was aware of it, the way you are aware of weather changing, a shift in the air around a particular part of the room, a quality of attention that she filed away for later, for some future moment when there would be time for things that were not immediate and necessary. Later was a long time coming. But it would come. Zosha's hand found hers in the dark. She held it. Outside, the storm continued. But it had changed its quality, less furious now, more determined, the way things become in their final hours when they have spent the best of themselves and are finishing on endurance alone. The walls held. The fire held. The hands held. And somewhere in the gray hour before the light, in the packed warmth of a cabin that everyone in the valley had called madness, something shifted, not in the weather, which did not shift yet, but in the room itself. In the particular way 19 people breathe when they have been through something together. In the quality of the silence between them. In the small sounds of people beginning to emerge from whatever interior space the night had driven them into. Beginning to look around. Beginning to see where they were. And who had kept them there. The light would come. It always came. The storm ended the way long things end, not with a conclusion, but with an absence. At some point in the early morning, the wind simply stopped pressing, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that several people woke from it the way you wake from a sound, startled by the lack of something that had been there so long it had become the texture of the world. Mara was already awake. She had been awake for some time, sitting near the stove in the gray pre-dawn, listening to the storm reduce itself from fury to insistence to stubbornness, to this final quiet. She had watched the fire through its last 2 feedings. She had watched the room breathe around her, all those people in all their exhausted arrangements, and she had let herself feel for the first time since the first knock had come. In the deep part of the night, the full weight of what had happened. 19 people. 2 families who had lost their roofs. 1 man whose hands had come back to their proper color only after 3 careful hours. 4 children who had slept better in this crowded bark-wrapped space than they would have slept in their own beds because their own beds had been open to the sky. 1 judge, 1 reverend, 1 man who had built every house in the valley and watched all of them fail at the thing a house is fundamentally for. She sat with all of this and did not try to resolve it into something simpler than it was. When the light came pale and exhausted, the light of a sky that has spent everything it had, she went to the door and opened it. The valley was white and altered. Every familiar shape had been revised. The path down to the town was gone under a depth of snow that made the ordinary landmarks unreadable. Trees had come down. She could see 3 from the doorway, large ones lying at angles that suggested they had not decided to fall, but had been made to. The lean-to at the side of the cabin had lost its roof, which she had expected, and had prepared for by moving everything inside hours before the storm arrived. The cabin itself was intact. Every wall, every seam. The bark had done what bark does not, fought the cold, but absorbed its pressure, and held its shape around the warmth within. She stood in the doorway for a long time, feeling the cold on her face, looking at the altered world. Behind her, the room began to wake. They left in pieces through the morning as the light strengthened and the snow became navigable. Each departure had its own texture. The family from the Blue Door house left first the father carrying the youngest child, the boy walking beside him, with Rex's particular farewell, the old dog following them to the edge of the property line and sitting there watching them down the slope, the way he watched all departures that required witnessing. As they reached the bottom of the path, the boy turned and looked back. He raised one hand. Zosha raised hers. The Reverend left with a quietness that was different from his arrivals in ordinary life, which tended toward ceremony. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Mara and seemed to be searching for the right words, the way a man searches who is accustomed to having the right words available, and has found for once that the occasion exceeds his vocabulary. "I was wrong to dismiss what you said," he said finally, plain and unadorned. "You came in," Mara said. "That's what mattered." He nodded and went. Judge Hargrove was last to leave of the official group. He stood at the door with his torn coat and his hat, which someone had found and returned to him, and he held out a folded document. She took it. She looked at it. It was the ordinance, or rather it was the revocation of the ordinance formal language, correctly structured, withdrawing the fire safety requirement as it applied to her property. His signature at the bottom was less composed than his official signatures usually were. The pen had pressed harder than necessary in places. He did not explain it. He did not apologize with words. He handed her the document and met her eyes for one moment, and then walked down the path without looking back, and she watched him go with the complicated feeling of a person who has been given back something that should never have been taken. Drummond came in the afternoon. He came alone as he had arrived alone in the storm. But this time he came in daylight, and he came with things, rather than without them, 3 men from his crew behind him, at a respectful distance, carrying tools and lumber and a rolled document tied with cord. He stopped at the edge of the property. He did not come further until she came to the door, and even then he did not come to the threshold. He stood at the edge in the way of a man who understands that proximity is a thing to be offered rather than assumed. He held out the rolled document. She unrolled it. It took a moment to read. It was longer than the judge's revocation, more detailed. A formal withdrawal of all pending complaints against the property. A written commitment witnessed by the 3 men behind him to teach the bark insulation method, which the document referred to without flourish as the Weston method, to any family in the valley who wished to learn it at no cost for as long as he was able to teach it. She read it to the end. She looked up at him. "Erickson tested it for 3 winters," she said. "He wrote that in the notebook." "I know," Drummond said. The men behind him were very still in the way of people who understand they are witnessing something that is not their business to interrupt. A long pause. The snow sat deep and bright around them. The valley altered and quieted, the light thin and honest. "You did this before," she said, "with someone else." He did not look away. "Yes." "She didn't have what you're giving me now." "No," he said, "she didn't." "Is there a way to find her?" Mara asked. Something moved in Drummond's face that she had not expected. Something that was not shame exactly, but was in its neighborhood, and older the look of a question he had been asking himself in the small hours of many mornings, and had not found the courage to answer. "I don't know," he said, "but I intend to try." She looked at him for a moment more. She looked at the document in her hands, at Alexi's name, carved in the doorframe, at the bark walls that had held through the night. "Erickson would be proud of you," she said. Drummond received this without speaking. He stood with it the way you stand with something that has been said that cannot be unsaid, and that you will be carrying for a long time. Then he turned and gave a small nod to the men behind him, and they began to move toward the lean-to with the lumber because the roof needed to be rebuilt, and there was no reason to wait. Zosha appeared at Mara's shoulder. She looked at Drummond's retreating back and then up at her mother. He didn't really say he was sorry, Zosha observed. No, Mara said. Are you angry? Mara considered this honestly the way she tried to consider everything. A little, she said. But anger isn't always the most useful thing to carry. Zosha thought about this for a moment. Then she went down the path to where Drummond was directing his men, and she stood in front of him until he stopped and looked down at her. Mama says people who are wrong need someone to teach them, Zosha said, not punish them. She taught you, even when you didn't ask for it. She looked at him with a direct measuring gaze that had always made adults feel somehow that they were being seen more clearly than they had intended. You should know that. Drummond looked at the 8-year-old girl for a long moment. He could not answer. He tried twice and stopped twice. He crouched down to her level, which was not a thing a man of his particular stature did easily, and he looked at her directly. I know it, he said. I'll try to deserve it. Zosha nodded once a nod that to anyone watching bore a striking resemblance to old Seward's, and went back up the path to the cabin. They found old Seward 2 days after the storm. A neighbor had gone to check on him, which is something neighbors do after difficult events, and had found him in his chair by his cold stove, his coat on his stick across his knees. He had gone quietly and completely sometime during the night of the storm in the way of very old men who have decided they are finished and simply stop. His face, the neighbor reported, had been entirely calm. Mara heard this and stood still for a moment in the middle of whatever she had been doing. She thought about the nod. The 2 nods, one at the edge of her property, when she had started from the wrong wall, one on the street, when no one else would hear her. The economy of it. The specific, complete quality of his acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of a man who knew she was right, and knew she would need someone to know it, even if that someone could not stand beside her. He had given his place to someone else, not in any dramatic way. Simply in the way of an old man who understood that the cold was coming, and that a seat inside the cabin meant 1 fewer seat for someone who still had years to use it. She went to his burial. She stood at the back of the small group because she had not known him well enough for the front and knew him too well for anywhere else. She stood there in the cold with Rex beside her and Zosha's hand in hers, and she said goodbye to him in the interior way she said goodbye to things completely and quietly, without performance. At the grave's edge, she set a branch of white birch. Just that. It seemed right. Walking home, Zosha asked did he know that he would give up his spot. I think so, Mara said. Was he afraid? Mara looked at the forest as they walked past it. The birch trees, standing white and quiet and still after the storm, every one of them intact, their dark patterned bark, doing what bark had always done. I think, she said slowly, that some people reach a point where they've been afraid of enough things for long enough that they just stop, and they spend whatever they have left on what matters. Zosha walked beside her, considering this. He mattered, Zosha said. Yes, Mara said. He did. Mrs. Bellamy was at the burial too, standing apart from the main group in the way of a person who was not sure of her welcome. She did not speak to Mara. Mara did not speak to her. But as the small gathering dispersed and people moved back toward the town and their altered houses, Mrs. Bellamy passed close enough that Mara could see her face. It was the face of a woman who had said a thing in the dark and had not taken it back, and who was living in the aftermath of that which is its own kind of reckoning. The currency of her voice which had always been the currency of certainty of definitive social pronouncement, had changed its value. Not worthless, but different. She would have to find a different way to spend it. Mara looked at her and thought about a daughter taken by machinery that runs on words. She thought about what it would take to understand that you had been part of that machinery. She thought about whether understanding was enough. It was not enough. But it was not nothing. She nodded once as Mrs. Bellamy passed. Mrs. Bellamy looked at her and nodded back, and they went their separate ways, which was the honest version of what was possible between them. The door hinge was fixed on a Tuesday. Henrik came in the morning with his tools, and Mara was on the roof of the rebuilt lean-to checking the new shingles when she heard the particular sound of metalwork being adjusted, the careful, patient sound of a craftsman attending to something small. She came down to find him on one knee at the cabin door, the hinge in pieces beside him, replacing the worn pin that had made the door drag on the left side since autumn. He had noticed the drag. He had not mentioned it. He had simply come back with the right pin. She stood and watched him work. His hands moved with the economy of someone who has done a thing so many times it has entered the body and no longer requires the mind. He fit the new pin seated, the hinge swung the door once on its repaired axis. It moved without sound, clean and level and right. Rex, sitting nearby, watched this procedure with the detached professional interest he brought to all human activities. Zosha came around the corner of the cabin and observed the repaired door, and then looked at Henrik, and then looked at her mother with the particular expression she wore when the adults around her were doing something obvious that they were pretending not to notice. "He's useful," she said in the perfectly serious tone of someone offering a considered assessment. Mara did not look at her daughter. She looked at the door. She felt something that she had not let herself feel in a very long time. Something small and careful, the feeling of a thing beginning, rather than ending, tentative and real as the first shoot of a plant coming through frost-hardened ground. "He is," she said. Henrik stood up and looked at neither of them directly, which was how he looked at things he felt strongly about, and began packing his tools. "There's a hinge on the lean-to as well," he said. "If you don't object." "The lean-to could use it," Mara said. He went to fix the lean-to hinge. Zosha watched him go, and then looked at her mother with a small, complete smile, the smile of a child who has been right about something, and is gracious enough not to mention it. Mara went back up to the roof. She stood on the roof of the rebuilt lean-to, and looked out at the valley below, at the town with its smoke and its lanterns, at the birch trees, at the edge of the property, at the bark walls of the cabin that had held through the worst night anyone in the valley could remember. She looked at all of it for a long moment. Then she picked up her tools and went back to work. That is the thing about people who build. They do not stop when the storm is over. They keep building the next wall, the next season, the next generation. They keep building because that is what they know, and because what they know has been given to them, and because something given must eventually be passed on. Many seasons passed. The valley changed the way valleys change slowly, in ways that only become visible when you look back from a sufficient distance. New houses went up on the slopes, and more than a few of them wore the bark treatment that Drummond's crew had begun to teach in the spring, following the storm, working from property to property with a methodical thoroughness that suggested a man paying a debt he had calculated carefully. He never said this. He simply worked, and his crew worked, and the knowledge moved through the community. The way knowledge moves when it is practically useful faster than fashion, slower than rumor, but with the particular permanence of a thing that works. The Weston method, as the document had called it, became the way things were done on the north-facing slopes and the exposed ridgelines. It became the thing new families were told about when they arrived, the way they were told about where to find the good water and which month the passes closed. It became ordinary, which is the highest thing a good idea can become. Drummond himself changed in the seasons that followed. Not dramatically, he was not a man built for dramatic change. But the methodical thoroughness with which he taught the bark method moving from property to property with his crew had a quality that anyone who had known him before the storm would have recognized as different. He had always been precise. Now he was also careful in a different way. Careful not to dismiss, careful to listen. Careful to ask what a structure was being asked to do before pronouncing on how it should be built. Erickson would have recognized the change if Erickson had lived to see it. Mara recognized it. She did not mention it. She simply noted it the way she noted all things that mattered quietly, completely, and without needing to say so aloud. The woman who had sold her land before Mara, the one whose name appeared in the old council records, who had 2 children and left before the next frost, was found eventually living in a valley 2 territories east. Drummond had sent someone to look. It had taken 2 full seasons to find her. When word came back, he sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote a letter. Whether she answered it, no one ever knew. But the letter was sent, and the sending of it was its own kind of accounting. Zosha grew into the kind of person her mother had recognized she would be: deliberate, observant, possessed of a patience that had been developed young under difficult conditions and had therefore become structural rather than effortful. She became a teacher. This surprised no one who had watched her sit beside a boy who would not speak and wait with her hand on a dog until he could. She taught in the Valley School, and then in the larger school that came after, and she taught reading and arithmetic and natural science, and in natural science she taught about bark, about the principle of it, about trapped air and the intelligence of organisms that had been solving the problem of cold for longer than any human civilization. She taught it with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which she had carried a piece of slate through a creek bed and called it schooling. On the wall of her classroom, she kept a map. Not a famous map, not an official one. A map she had made herself on good paper showing the valley and the slopes around it and the surrounding territory. On it, she marked with small, careful symbols the houses that used the bark method. Over the years, the symbols multiplied until the map looked less like a record of individual decisions and more like a kind of slow growth, the spread of a forest, one tree at a time. Rex died on a morning in a winter that was cold, but not brutal, the kind of winter that is simply winter without drama. He went the way he had lived, without fuss, with dignity, in the warmth of the cabin where he had spent his years after the refuse pile. He was very old. His muzzle had gone entirely white, and the ear that had always sat differently from the other had stopped making the effort altogether. Zosha buried him under the first birch tree, the one her mother had walked to on the earliest morning of this whole long story, the tree whose bark had come off in the first pale sheet, the tree that had started everything. She carved the stone herself with the care she brought to things that deserved care. He kept watch so we could sleep. She cried, burying him. She was not a person who cried easily or often, which meant that when she cried, it was complete and serious the way she was complete and serious about everything. Her mother stood beside her and held her hand, and neither of them spoke, and the birch trees stood around them in their winter quiet, patient, and enduring, and exactly what they had always been. Mara had known many losses by then. She had grown familiar with the shape of them, the way a space that had been full becomes empty and stays empty even when you put other things into it. Rex left a space of that kind, not the largest she had known, but particular, specific to him. The threshold where he used to sleep looked different for a long time after. Not sad exactly, just aware of itself. A threshold that remembered what it had been to have a guardian. The boy from the Blue Door house, the one who had not spoken after the roof came down, the one who had placed one finger against Rex's shoulder and then his whole hand, and then finally cried, came to stand beside Zosha at the burial. He was older now, taller, with the particular gravity of a child who has learned early that the world contains things worth grieving. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which was the right thing, and Zosha did not look at him, which was also the right thing. They had both learned from the same teacher, after all. On an afternoon, many seasons after the storm, more seasons than Zosha could have counted. From the vantage of that first winter, more than would have seemed possible to a woman sitting alone at a table with a piece of paper and a pen, and a daughter's voice pulling her back from the edge, Mara sat on the step of the cabin with her granddaughter. The child was 7 and curious in the way of children who have been encouraged to be curious, which is the most complete kind of curious. She had her grandmother's eyes, the particular quality of eyes that look at things rather than past them. She had been asking questions for most of the afternoon. This was normal. "Did you really live here?" she asked. "From the beginning, just you and Mama." "Just us and Rex," Mara said. "And the tools. And a notebook that told us what to do before we knew we needed to know it." The child looked at the cabin, at the bark walls that had been maintained and renewed over the years, at the seams that were still sealed with pine pitch, at the north wall that had been started first, because an old man had said one true thing at the right moment. "Wasn't it scary?" the child asked. Mara looked at the forest. The birch trees were bare in the late season, their white trunks bright against the gray-brown of the deeper wood, and she could see, if she looked at the right angle in the right light, the pale mark on the first tree where the first sheet of bark had been taken. The tree had healed around it. Trees do that. "Every single day," she said. The child turned to look at her. "But you didn't stop." Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about a table and a pen and a piece of paper and a voice from the dark saying a father's name. She thought about 3 matches and yarrow tea and a long night of counting breath. She thought about a nod at the edge of a street from a man who gave his place away, and a hammer with an adjusted handle, and a dog who had appeared at the edge of the property and sat down and simply waited to be kept. She thought about what it is to be a tree in winter, not fighting, not fleeing, not pretending the cold is not there, just wearing the coat, just waiting. "The tree does not fight the cold," she said. The child had heard this before. She would hear it again. That was the nature of the things worth saying. They needed to be said more than once to fully enter a person. "It wears a coat and waits, and when the spring comes—" "It is still standing," the child finished. She had heard this part. "Yes," Mara said. "Still standing." The child leaned against her grandmother's side and looked at the forest, and Mara put her arm around her, and they sat together in the thin, late light, while the birch trees held their quiet, practiced patience around them. "Will you teach me?" the child asked. "What great-grandfather knew, what you know." "Yes," Mara said. "I will teach you everything." The light moved through the trees, the way it always had, particular the light of this valley in this season. The light that fell on bark and pitch and the carved name in the doorframe and the stone under the first birch, and all the accumulated evidence of a life that had been built from nothing by hand without permission, against the considered opinion of every person who had been certain it could not be done. The same light that would fall on the classroom map with its spreading symbols, on the houses that wore their bark coats into the cold, on every family that had learned from a widow on a ladder on a frozen slope that the oldest knowledge is often the truest, and that a woman who refuses to sign her name to defeat is a more powerful force than anyone who has never been tested can easily imagine. The light fell on all of it, and the cabin stood. And if you are facing your own storm right now, your own cold, your own narrow margin, your own collection of voices telling you that what you are building is madness, remember her. Remember that the tree does not fight the cold. It wears a coat, and it waits. And in the spring, it is still standing,